Welcome to Recombination Nation. Today, I am talking to one of my favorite new geopolitical analysts, Professor Jiang, who I've been following his work for, I think, at least a year now. It's exploded on YouTube with his prolific series of lectures and podcasts that he's done, talking about all of the different threads in history and geopolitics and culture, weaving them together in a way that I think the world is hungry for at the moment in these uncertain times. So, Professor Jiang, do you want to tell us a bit more about your life journey and how you ended up in this really peculiar position in life?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me to be on your show, Shane. I'm really looking forward to having a pretty thorough discussion with you. For most of my career, I have been an educator. So, I'm very interested in inspiring young people to think for themselves. And I've tried many different strategies. And these past 4 years, I've been focused on the teaching of history and trying to tell history as a coherent story, how we got to where we are and where we're going. And I've been uploading these lectures on YouTube. And one thing that I do that's interesting is I try to use history as a guide to understand the future, to predict the future. And it's not serious. I'm not trying to be a Nostradamus. I'm just trying to provoke students into seeing how events connect with each other. That if our understanding of how history develops, then we can extrapolate into the future. And so I've been making these certain predictions about how things might unfold. And some of these predictions have proven to be accurate. So, for example, I predicted that in 2024, Trump would win. I predicted that he would start a war with Iran. And I predicted that there'll be civil conflict in the United States. So those are my three major predictions. And unfortunately, they're unfolding pretty accurately.
Hmm.
So that's why my channel blew up on YouTube.
So, what would you say is your ultimate motivation for all the research and the outreach that you're doing? Like, what's the grand kind of strategic goal?
Well, I have three kids. I have three young children, and I want to build them a legacy. I want to educate them to think for themselves. I want them to give them the tools to be masters of their own destiny. So that's what personally drives me. At the same time, I feel that even though we as humans we're headed towards decades of tribulation, of chaos, of conflict, I still believe that during this time of troubles and tribulation, we still have the capacity to imagine for ourselves a brighter future. And so I want to teach people to think in a certain way that allows them to better understand the past so as to better imagine the future.
Yeah, yeah, I see that as wisdom as a form of cultural inheritance that one generation can gather together and pass on to the next to help them make the best decisions possible in life.
Exactly.
Mm,
That's
mm,
exactly correct. Yes.
mm. And also, you have an unusual kind of backstory for a historian that you started out, I believe, in literature and philosophy. And how has that kind of changed your approach? Does that give you a kind of outsider's advantage over people who are just trained to be historians from like the very beginning?
Well, from a very early age, I love to read, and my reading is very broad. So I love to read science fiction. I love to read history. I was a major fan of the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. Like I read all of his books, and there were like dozens and dozens of them. And I've always been a very curious person. I've been a very astute observer. I'm very interested in why people behave the way they do. Um, I'm I really have a deep sense of empathy, and so I think those are my three major strengths. I'm a curious person. I love to read, and I have high empathy. I studied English literature at Yale because that was really the best department at Yale. I actually went into Yale hoping to study physics and mathematics, because I'm Chinese. But I just fell in love with literature. I just fell in love with Milton, with Shakespeare, with Keats, with Shelley, because for me, they were asking the question of like, why are we here and where are we going? They were trying to, in their poetry, decipher the fundamental truths of what it means to be human. And that's something that I've wrestled with all my life. So I don't think that I'm a historian. If people ask me like what you do, like who are you? I would just say I'm an educator and I'm interested in the pursuit of knowledge. I'm a deeply curious person. And it's really the internet that has bred me as a historian.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, okay, so let's dive into the big stack of questions that I've put together from mass consuming like all of the output that you've had. Just it's given me a whole lot of jumping off points that I think you'd be really interesting to talk to about this, particularly because you have, I'm imagining, a unique perspective both into Western culture and Eastern culture, and the contrasts and potential rivalries and frictions that are emerging and evolving in the current dynamic. So, where I wanted to start off, I grew up in Australia in the 1980s when we had a massive economic boom linked to Japan. And it caused a real fascination with Japanese culture, which I think has lingered to today. And what I'm really hoping that you can help me understand is after that, we had an even longer, bigger economic boom due to Chinese trade, but it didn't trigger the same fascination with Chinese culture. Instead, we developed a lot of anxiety about Japan. And this is despite the history of Japan bombing Australia during World War II. Like, I remember like old timers in the 80s say, oh, never trust the Japanese. Why so different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's very observant. And I think this is true for most nations in the world. I think that Japanese culture, it's very pervasive. So anime is extremely popular among young kids. But then you look at Japanese literature and especially Japanese cinema, right? Kurosawa is one of my favorite movie makers of all time. And some of these Japanese movies are just profound, deeply profound. Tokyo Story is one of the best films ever made. Chinese philosophy. Shintoism. It's really deep. And when you go to Japan, it's very easy to fall in love with the culture because Japanese people take extreme pride in being Japanese. There's a professionalism, there's a profound patriotism that is embedded in Japanese society, and that is a very inspiring, very moving feeling when you're in Japan. The problem with China is that Chinese society and Japanese society are not alike in any way. Japanese people and Chinese people, they share genetic origins. They're basically the same race. Japan was settled by Chinese who migrated over there like thousand years ago. So it's really the same race of people. But these two cultures are night and day. So Japan, it's an island, and it's a very poor island that has always been threatened by China, which is its hegemon, and that forced Japanese people to be more insular, but also more unified
Mm,
to see themselves as one people. And they're an extremely resilient people. So whenever they feel as though they're falling behind, they come together as a people and make the necessary social, political, economic changes to improve as a people. So
mm,
the most recent example, of course, was the Meiji Restoration. But even after World War II, when their industry was being dominated by these state-owned enterprises called Zabatsu. Sorry, I don't know the exact pronunciation. They did make the necessary political changes to reduce the power and make this society much more entrepreneurial. And this is a pattern throughout Japanese history. It is an extremely resilient, extremely open-minded, extremely innovative society
mm.
because it feels threatened by the hegemon that is China.
Whereas
China is in the
China's
opposite.
had the luxury of being so big that they can afford to ignore the rest of the world for much of the
That's
time.
exactly correct. That's
Yeah.
exactly correct. So China is in the opposite situation where it is the hegemon of East Asia, and it feels invincible because it's protected by these natural borders. It has the sea to the east, it has the Himalayas to the west, desert to the north, and then the jungles of Southeast Asia to the south. So China feels invincible. It's a middle kingdom,
Mm,
and it's never really developed a culture of self-reflection and open-mindedness and innovation. Much more problematic is that for thousands of years, it's had this bureaucratic culture, and the bureaucracy is first and foremost interested in imperial control. And it does that by controlling the culture. And so there's very little grassroots dynamic innovation in China.
mm,
And whatever innovation is created through, local storytelling, it's captured by the center and it's edited out. It's diluted.
mm,
It like the culture becomes extremely conformist, extremely bureaucratic, extremely top down. And as a result, it's not as inspiring. It's not as organic. It's not as natural and intuitive as Japanese culture is.
mm,
And so when you watch Chinese film, you're not as inspired as you would watching Japanese film. When you read Chinese literature, it doesn't strike you as truthful and beautiful in the way that Japanese literature strikes you. So soft power has always been a huge problem in China, and so that's my explanation
mm.
for it. Obviously, it's a very complex issue.
Is there a danger as the US loses its preeminence, it's going to become more like Chinese in its dynamic? It's going to withdraw from the rest of the world and become an inward-looking fortress?
Well, I mean, this is one of the great ironies in modern history, in that China and the United States are much more similar than they're different.
Mm,
Certainly, China is much more similar to the United States than China is similar to Japan.
mm,
And I think that's why when it comes to people exchanges, when Americans come to China, it's much more easy for Americans to fall in love with China than it is for, say, Americans to fall in love with Japan. I think there's a natural affinity
mm,
between Americans and Chinese, and that's why I think in the long term, this conflict that we're seeing right now between China and the United States is going to go away. And
mm.
what's going to emerge is a rapprochement, or a more lasting friendship between China and America. The other issue, and as you point out, America has soft power because of its military dominance. You're sort of like forced to
Yeah.
watch Hollywood movies. You're forced to read American novels, even though in your heart you know this is pretty mediocre stuff.
Mm,
And it's kind of insulting to humanity that this stuff is being foisted upon us by the Americans. So I think that America is a deeply acultural society like China. And
mm.
it was Oscar Wilde who said it best when he said that America went from barbarism to decadence and skipped civilization in between.
I love that. A related question. Do complex languages, and with China, I'm particularly thinking of the written language, function as a kind of cultural immune system? So, and in some ways, that can insulate and protect a nation, but it can also make it difficult for it to form friendships and to reach out. And I wonder if that's a particular challenge that people are aware of in China. And maybe technology could be the thing that finally overcomes that, so people don't have to learn thousands of symbols in a new language to interact.
Yeah, so I've said this many times in the past. I believe that as an educator, the Great Wall of China is the language itself. And so, as you may know, the Chinese language, it's not a phonological language. It's a character-based language, and that makes it extremely hard to learn. In
Mm,
fact, the only way to learn a language is through many years of rote memorization,
mm,
and that becomes the basis for the education system as well as for the culture. So, in the West, if you speak English, and then it'll take you like a whole day to learn the alphabet and to read naturally. And that's why in the West, kids are just encouraged to read stories, to tell stories, because it's so easy to pick up the language. But in China, it's the opposite. You have to
Mm,
spend years of methodically memorizing the characters. And there's a lot of characters, but there's at least 2,000 characters
mm,
that you must memorize if you want to be functional in Chinese society. The other issue with the language is that there are only a limited number of sounds in a language. So in an alphabet, you have a great diversity of sounds. And so you can just transliterate foreign words into language. So you have a lot of Chinese words like ping pong, kung fu, kowtow that are just transliterations. But
mm,
in Chinese, you can't do that.
mhm,
So, for example, if you want to translate California into Chinese, it becomes California, okay,
mm,
which is like when you hear this, like completely different.
mm,
And as a result, Chinese think it is extremely burdensome, stressful to learn new things from the outside world.
mm,
Also, when you try, because you can't transliterate the language, it's very hard to bring in foreign concepts. So, for example, the word cinema is translated as "daying" in Chinese, which means electric shadows.
mm,
And you think, well, that's metaphorical, that's beautiful. But at the same time, you want to very quickly introduce new concepts and popularize them and make them entrenched. And it's hard to do that in China.
mm,
Um, and so there is that sort of motivation to learn new things in China. So not only is it hard to import new concepts into Chinese, but most people don't want to learn these new concepts because it is so taxing, so
mm,
burdensome for them to learn these concepts. And so people are going to do what is the path of least resistance. If you are the Middle Kingdom and you don't really have to work with the rest of the world, if you don't really need to trade like the way Japan trades, you're not going to transform, you're not going to innovate your language in a way that allows you to import new concepts.
mm.
So the language is really the Great Wall of China.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite to English, which absorbs words so readily from other cultures. But I wonder if there's a joint opportunity for English to reform its horrible spelling system and for maybe China to reform its overly complicated writing system. And I don't know, I'll maybe come back to this later when we're talking more about education. But yeah, I think we're at a really interesting point in history, particularly with all the new technologies that can facilitate acquiring new languages and developing new languages, even. And next thing I really want to talk about, I've been following a lot about the East Asian let it rot culture of the younger generations feeling like they have no reason to work hard like the previous generation did. And I'm interested if you have any perspectives about how that compares with similar things in the West, like quiet quitting.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think it's a very similar process. And I just think that nowadays, young people feel as though there's really no hope for them. All the opportunities, all the wealth, all the resources have been monopolized by older generations, especially the baby boomers.
Mm,
So, in this sort of situation, they don't really have the motivation. They really don't have the drive to really try to improve themselves. I mean, like the way I see it is a good metaphor is to think of the game Monopoly. And what's happening is that you have a few people, they've monopolized the board, right? They own Boardwalk, they own Park Avenue, and they don't want the game to end. And everyone else wants the game to end.
mm,
And we live in a rentier economy. We live in,
mhm.
in, in a giant game of Monopoly. And not only are young people forced to continue playing the game, but they're still paying exorbitant rents.
Yeah, yeah.
So letting it rot, I think, is the least provocative, the
Mm,
least violent option that they have,
mm, mm.
right? Because I think the natural response would be to like overthrow the game,
Yeah,
right? To turn the
flipping
game
the
over
board
and
is the
start
most
again.
fun move that you have left, even if it
And they can't
upsets
do that
everyone. Yeah.
because of the say monopoly on violence. So
Mm,
I think young people feel a deep sense of frustration, a deep sense of hopelessness, and they're depressed. I don't know any other word to describe it. They're depressed, and all these drugs are being forced on their throats, right? All these SSRIs,
Mm.
which are driving them crazy. And then the internet is also another form of drug. They're watching Netflix, they're watching pornography, they're playing video games. It's all to basically force them to continue playing the game when there's really no hope for them. So
Mm.
I think Let It Rot is a very peaceful strategic response to the reality that they're facing.
Do you think we're looking at one or more kind of lost generations before that pattern breaks? Because it's kind of like a pig going through a snake in the demographic pyramid. Like after the world wars, there was that big baby boom in various parts of the world. And at some point, it looks like that generation is going to age out and we'll at least end up with a more balanced pyramid, maybe eventually.
Yeah, I think you just look at trends. The baby boomers aren't dying.
Mm,
That's that is the major issue. These pension plans in the Western world, Australia, Canada, United States, they were developed in the 1950s, 1960s when people lived to like 75 at
mm,
best.
mm-hmm.
Now baby boomers will live to like 95, 100. And whatever models that you had in the 50s, it didn't take this into account. Because remember, not only are they collecting pension, but they're maintaining their control over the wealth of society so it can't circulate. All
Yeah,
this money is being put in a property, the stock market, and this wealth isn't circulating. And that's going to cause massive economic problems that people are not yet aware of. Like
mm,
it's going to kill entrepreneurship in these societies because all the money is being put into the stock market and property.
yeah,
So you see this over financialization in the Western world, where the stock market is booming, but no one's working,
mm,
right? No
mm,
one's employed,
yeah.
no one's starting new businesses, no one's manufacturing. So you have tremendous discrepancy between the haves and have-nots in the West right now.
A related question. I was going to bring this up later, but do you think there could be a renegotiation of the place of death in culture in if the stresses get big enough? And I'm thinking of Canada, a place you have experience with. It seems to be leading the charge with medically assisted dying, and I wonder how that option translates into Eastern cultures, which I think have a different uh, attitude towards death. The West, I think, is more uh, terrified around that.
That's a great question, and it's something I've been thinking a lot for the past few years. So if you look at MAID, medical assistance in dying Canada, it is um, increasing pretty rapidly. The problem is the people who are dying, the people who opt for MAID, are poor people.
Mm,
And so that wealth is still trapped. Um, it's still a top-heavy system.
mm,
Unless you figure out a system in which, the rich die off and this money is allowed back into circulation, this money is allowed to rejuvenate the economy, then you haven't solved any issue. And in fact, made, I think it is a very morally corrosive system
mm,
because it's very utilitarian, right? It's just meant to kill off poor people so that the rich don't have to stand in line in hospitals anymore. And people know this.
mm,
And so you lose your cohesion, you lose your purpose, your morality as a society. So I think in the long term, what Canada is doing is basically digging its own grave. So but at the same time, I think there's really no solution to this problem. Now we go over to the east. I think that the only country that I see in the short term capable of resolving this issue is Japan.
mm,
Because as I said before, even though the Japanese have tremendous respect for the elderly, it is extremely cohesive, unified society where people are willing to make the necessary sacrifices to stay resilient, to be innovative.
mm,
So it's perfectly plausible. Okay, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I
mm,
see in the next 5, 10 years that as a society, Japanese elderly say to the society, I'm 80 years old, I'm 85, I've had a good life. I don't want to be a burden on society anymore, so I will choose to do euthanasia, and it's going to come organically
Mm,
from the elderly. Now, of course, the government what they will do is maybe give the families a lot of money
mm,
in to compensate. But that's going to be a massive signal to our Japanese society. It's going to rejuvenate the society. It's going to inspire the young to take control over their lives. So if Japan were to do this, if maybe 10 to 20% of the elderly were to say, I've had a good life, I'm ready to pass on because I don't want to be a burden to the rest of society. And honestly, there's no point in me continuing to live like this because I've had a good life.
mm,
Then that's going to rejuvenate Japanese society. And it's really going to make Japan the most economic dynamic and the most military vibrant society in East Asia.
mm,
China's the opposite.
mhm,
China is a society in which the respect deference for the elderly. It's really the core value of society. And that's why China implemented the COVID lockdowns in a draconian manner that it did
mm,
for 3 years. I mean, it destroyed the entire economy. But in China, what comes first is the respect for the elderly. And it was very painful, very hard, very arduous for China to leave the COVID lockdown system and move towards a more, open system.
mm.
So yeah, I mean, like the elderly issue will never be resolved in China, but it could be resolved in Japan, and that's why I think in the long term, Japan has much better prospects than China.
Do you think if Japan implements that policy and shows that it can be done successfully without, becoming dystopian, that other nations around the world could follow in that path if their pension imbalance and a demographic imbalance gets severe enough?
Yeah, so in the West right now, the government is captured by the baby boomer generation, by the
Mm,
elderly.
mm,
The West has basically become a gerontocracy. This is
mm,
true everywhere. The United
hmm
States, Europe, Australia, Canada. And as a result, I think the Western response to this Japanese policy will be one of disgust,
hmm
one of anger, one of contempt. Like, how dare they do this to elderly people who've spent decades and decades contributing to the betterment of society? This is a disgrace. This is a betrayal. I mean, I know ba very wealthy baby boomers. They're millionaires. They have the best lives. And whenever we discuss it, it's never like one of gratitude. It's not like, oh wow, I am so fortunate to be a millionaire and to go on vacations and to eat sushi every night. It's always like we need better healthcare.
mm.
Uh,
They're, they're,
it's
they're
like
sprinting on that what is it? The treadmill. I can't get the word out. Hegemony. No, hedonic treadmill. They're sprinting
right,
on the
yeah.
hedonic treadmill. There we go.
Yeah, it's always like how can we improve ourselves, right? It's
hmm
always like how can we get more out of society as opposed to like let's show gratitude for the wonderful life we've had. Because
mm
like as a baby boomer, you've had the best life. If you
mm
grew up in the West in the 1950s, 60s, hey, you had the best school system. You had the best jobs. You had the most money. You had the best pension. It was one of continuous economic growth, one of continuous optimism,
mm
one of continuous military triumph, right? You've had
mm
a good life.
mm
Now, let's move on and give an opportunity to future generations,
mm
your children, your
mm
grandchildren,
hmm
and
If you have any.
they don't want to do that. They're not
Um,
going to do that.
Now, also, China was one of the last big regions to go undergo full industrialization, and they did so on a scale and a speed that's never been seen before. And has that sparked something like the Romantic movement that happened in the West during the 19th century industrialization? And I would even say Japan has had a kind of romanticism around nature that's, I mean, think of the Ghibli movies. Is there something comparable in China that's been a kind of cultural counter-reaction?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this is my understanding. In the West, industrialization was a all society movement, and it brought tremendous cultural, political, and philosophical change to society. And that's why there was this counter movement, as you say, the Romantics, and a return to nature. In China, I don't think you can. I think industrialization has been really about the colonization of the Chinese mind. And what I mean by that is that China did not organically industrialize. In 1980s, America started to shift technology, wealth, expertise to the Chinese market, because it wanted to basically colonize Chinese cheap labor and use that cheap labor in order to manufacture plastic goods for the American market.
Mm.
So it was never an organic process. Even today, you can argue that the Chinese economy, it's very much a colony of the American empire.
Mm.
So in my observations of China, and I've been in China for, almost 30 years now, we haven't seen the sort of intellectual flowering or blossoming that you would see with increased wealth. In fact, you see the opposite. You see a much more colonial mindset. You see much greater materialism. You see much more intellectual subservience to the Western Empire. So I see China as really a colony of the Anglo-American Empire.
Has it also, to much extent, been colonized by Western environmentalism? Like I've seen a documentary like Under the Dome about various toxic pollutants from various industries in some locations. But is that a pervasive kind of concept, or are people is that not trickling through as much?
Yeah, so when America offshored its manufacturing to China, it did so knowing that China would basically exploit its cheap labor, but it would also exploit its environment.
Hmm.
And you're right in that, in theory, as a nation becomes much more wealthy, it's going to focus more on quality of life, on standard of living. That means cleaner air and cleaner water.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, when I say that China is a colony of America, I mean that the Chinese elite are choosing to immigrate to the Western world, to Australia, to America. So they're not incentivized to actually clean up the environment because their kids are not growing up here.
Hmm.
They're incentivized to continue to pollute the environment. And so what we're seeing in China, like all these vaunted industries, right? So electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, rare earth mineral production. What people don't really appreciate is the impact on the environment because of this technological production. In fact, listen, rare earth minerals, it's a misnomer because most country actually has access to rare earth minerals. Why they don't do it, why they don't mine these rare earth minerals is because they're extremely destructive.
Hmm.
They will
Hmm.
destroy your environment. They're extremely costly in the long term. But China, it's a colony. It doesn't really care about the long-term impact on the environment. So it's perfectly willing to, at scale, at mass, mine rare earth minerals. So that's something that people don't really appreciate about rare earth minerals.
Is the dynamic almost the reverse of the Mongol conquests of China? That rather than these outsiders coming in to like seize control of the throne, they're like creating an escape pod to get out, to like take everything that isn't nailed down and leave.
I mean, the reality is most of the Princeton class, they're overseas.
Mm.
So it's a plantation economy. China has
Mm.
essentially become a plantation economy.
Mm.
The things that you read about in the media, I mean, the media is just gaslighting you. I mean, when it's telling you, look how wonderful China is because it has artificial intelligence. Look how wonderful China is because it has all these electric vehicles. They don't talk about the impact on the environment and how maybe
Mm.
in 2 or 3 generations, the air is not breathable. The water's not drinkable.
Interesting. Interesting. Kind of related topic. China is pushing the limits of biotechnology, and notably, they produced the first genetically modified humans not that long ago. Though the scientist who did it was acting without authorization and got imprisoned for a while. But I've seen various statements that East Asian cultures are less squeamish about biotechnology compared to the West. And is that a genuine reflection in your experience? And how do you think that might influence the future of biotechnology in East Asia?
Well, I mean, the issue in East Asia is that there isn't as much respect for human dignity and human rights as there is in the Western world. So I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, these Harvard scientists were coming to China to conduct DNA studies. Why were they doing this? Because you didn't actually have to ask for permission to take people's blood samples in China. China was perfectly happy to allow this because it meant, quick cash for these officials, for the scientists. So what's really important to understand is that Chinese science, it is a colony of Western science.
Mm,
So going back to the example of these genetically modified twins, well, that person was working under the tutelage of his mentor at Stanford University, right?
yeah.
So where was he getting the expertise? Where was he getting the technology to do this? Well, he's been given to it by scientists in America because Americans can't do this legally in the United States. So they outsource it to China.
It's the same
And this
dynamic
is a
as
recurring
the
theme
rare
in
earth
Chinese
mines.
science.
It's like the rare earth mines. They're not willing to do it in their backyard, but they are willing to sponsor it in China.
Well, they can't do it because they'll be sued up the ass.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Um, we talked a bit before about technology and language and cultural barriers. Do you see the possibility of a new global language emerging through the internet that breaks down some of the barriers to places like China? Like we can use things like Google Translate, for
Yeah.
free today, and it's quite amazing. But to have a simple, accessible language that everybody could talk, would that be something that would appeal to people in China as opposed to learning English?
Well, I mean, you can make the argument that English is already the global language. And it's been the global language for hundreds of years. And as a result, there's a dumbing down of human civilization because humans were not meant to speak a global language. Look at the
Mm,
Tower of Babel, right? They
mm,
were meant to communicate their own language because their language, it is a manifestation of their own organic culture.
mm,
And it's really an expression of their values, it's expression of their tradition, of the mythologies of their religion.
mm,
And so, Hegel talks a lot about this, how culture comes as an expression, a manifestation of your tradition. And without that tradition, the culture would suck.
mm,
So I understand that we believe that globalization is fundamentally a good thing, but just in terms of cultural production,
mm,
just in terms of like ideas being expressed, science being advanced, um, it has not been very effective.
mm. I guess the model I'm looking at would be an auxiliary language that's designed to only have a few thousand words in it and a grammar that most speakers from major world languages can access, can find relatively intuitive. That's the model I'm seeing that would leave room for local native languages in their full glory and complexity, but provide a bridge, a narrow bridge, admittedly.
Well, I think the big focus are on two things. The big focus is on artificial intelligence, which would sort of negate the need for an auxiliary language because the AI system could translate simultaneously
Mm,
everything that happens online. Okay,
mm,
so when I'm speaking Chinese, what you would see, what you hear is English automatically.
mm,
So AI is one major trend. The other major trend is transhumanism, right? So the idea of Neuralink,
mm,
where you don't even have to speak anymore. You can just communicate thoughts. So I think that's where a lot of the money is being invested. And so if you don't have financing or funding for the creation of an auxiliary language, then you won't receive one. I also don't really see the appeal of having an auxiliary language because Like, yeah, I don't really see the need for it.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Now, I was also really fascinated by one of your lectures that claimed or explored how Chinese culture doesn't have an eschatology or a narrative for the end of time, whereas in the West, like that's a very core myth of like our current mindset. Even if you like leave behind religious worldviews, the scientific worldview loves coming up with like end of world scenarios to obsess over. And I just wonder, was that something that's ancestral and the Eastern cultures managed to shake it off? Or is it something that the West invented? And if so, like, what was the driving force for inventing that new myth?
Right. The problem with China is it doesn't have an eschatology, but much more fundamentally, it doesn't have that many stories. So I
Mm,
have three kids, and I tell a lot of stories to my children, and I have them read a lot of books. The problem is that when you buy Chinese books for children, okay, these are children's stories, it's all just facts and figures.
mm,
You know, the year that the pyramids were built, how high the pyramids were, um, how the distance between the moon and the earth. It's not a story. You look at these Chinese festivals like Mid-Autumn Festival, Chinese New Year's, there aren't any stories
mm,
to these festivals. It's all about food, you know, like okay, so during the Mid-Autumn Festival, let's have a moon cake. During Chinese New Year's, let's have a family meal of like dumplings. It's always about eating and about food and never about stories and tradition and religion. And I think this goes back to the idea that for the longest time, China was a bureaucracy. The problem with stories is that they're all living.
mm,
Stories hark back to a tradition, they hark back to a past, but they also inspire people to act. They also inspire people to dream of the future, right? So you look at the Vikings and what made the Vikings such brilliant explorers, what made them such tremendous adventurers is they love storytelling.
mm.
You look at Norse mythology, wonderful, vibrant, dynamic stories. And so the Vikings were always in competition to explore new worlds so they could bring back new stories to um, tell their friends, to brag to their friends about. And so stories have a power unto themselves. And I think that the imperial bureaucracy always saw them as a threat. That's why you don't have that many stories in China.
Interesting. I wonder if it relates to scale as well, that like up to a certain scale of a society, a story can be really powerful for motivating people. But if the culture gets too large, those stories tend to fragment and you end up with schisms and the power that motivates the previously united population now motivates two halves to fight each other over ridiculous things that don't really matter all that much. Whereas if you have a more bureaucratic approach to culture, you can scale it indefinitely without that danger.
I think you're absolutely right. So, a book that I would recommend to your listeners is Seeing Like a State by James
Yeah,
Scott.
yeah,
And he
yeah.
makes the argument that what a bureaucracy does is it transforms society in a way that allows it to be best managed by a bureaucracy.
Mm.
The elimination of organic, local ideas and traditions is one salient feature of a bureaucracy, and that's something that we definitely see in China. And it's a natural process. It's not nefarious. It's not they intend to lobotomize the culture, but it's just what happens when you have a bureaucracy. And China's had a bureaucracy for the past 2,000 years.
Is this happening in practice with digital culture? Like people don't even have like the same TV show that they can relate to each other with anymore. Everyone's watching their own separate little pocket of culture. And even though the stories might still be powerful enough on their own, they don't have cohesion across the entire culture anymore. And that actually makes
I
us
think you're
easier
absolutely
to
right.
rule. It makes us easier to
Yeah, I
manage
think
and
you're absolutely
rule.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the great appeal of the internet, right? It locks everyone into their own little bubbles, and as a result, they can be more easily controlled and brainwashed.
Mm. Um, Related question. Do you think the era of nation states is coming to an end and we kind of already live in a globalized bureaucracy?
Yeah, so I think nation states were a recent phenomenon. They are a recent phenomenon. They've only been around for, 200, 300, 400 years, they really picked up speed after the French Revolution. Nation states don't make any sense. It actually makes no sense to classify people according to their race, their language, and to impose artificial borders around the world. And it's led to silly things like world wars.
Mm,
So I think the era of the nation state, I mean, it's about to end.
mm,
But I don't think we're heading towards a world government. I think that there's too much resilience, there's too much imagination, there's too much diversity in the human tradition to allow for world government, even though things are trending towards a world government. I think it's very likely that we're heading back towards a time of the city state. And I think the
ah.
city state is a much more natural phenomenon than the nation state.
Do you think those city-states will be their most successful when they're democratic, or is Singapore a really good example of a different approach?
So I think a good analogy is the Greek polis, right? The Greek
Mm,
city states.
mm,
And you will have diversity of government, but you will definitely have much more human agency and human liberty than you have under the nation state, because you need to galvanize, you need to energize everyone. And you do that in a much more democratic setting. So the hegemon at that time was Athens, and Athens was the most vibrant democracy. They had to be democracy because they needed everyone to participate in the wealth creation in Athens. So I think the city-state will be much more enlightened, much more democratic, much more liberal time in human history than during the nation state.
Do you think those functional city-states will be tied to geography in the same way as they used to be, or could the internet allow groups of dispersed people to coordinate economically, culturally, politically in ways that were never possible before?
That's a great question. So when I think of city-states, I think in terms of geography, but you're absolutely right in that you could have new entities that arise that are much more ephemeral. So for example, multinationals
Mm,
could be a force unto themselves. Military cartels could also be possible. Religions. So I think we're moving towards a time when organization, organization, it's much more vibrant, much more diverse. The city states, I think, will be the main organizational unit, but you could also have other conversations as well.
mm, mm. Um, do you think some of the tension between geopolitical actors is partly designed to manage domestic politics? Like it's for domestic consumption that you are, waving a saber at people over the other side.
I think it's entirely for domestic consumption. I don't think these nation states have a reason to fight each other.
Hmm,
We live in a time of abundance, and these nation states are mostly self-sufficient. And they're not so self-sufficient. They benefit more from trade than
hmm,
than they do from conflict. So, if you just look at the entirety of human history, these conflicts arise because of instability within the hierarchy. So Peter Turchin has a term called elite overproduction.
hmm,
So what happens is different factions of elite, they fight each other, and then they draw in other nation states in order to further their own power struggle.
hmm, hmm.
So I don't think the United States and Russia have actual geopolitical differences, but their domestic realities force them to engage in silly adventures overseas.
Yeah, yeah. I also wonder if some wars are basically like a live firing training exercise for bored militaries. Like basically they're just using it as an opportunity to beat up on somebody geopolitically inconsequential that it's kind of just trooped up to let's check out our new weapons and see how well they work.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I think like the military industrial complex, it's a important factor. You need to just justify the bureaucracy, the military industrial complex bureaucracy by starting new wars. If you spend billions of dollars on new weapons, then you're kind of forced to use them.
Mm,
Another factor is that as an empire, you need to maintain the perception of a military hegemon.
Mm,
So that's why you go and you beat up, these third world nations like Libya and Syria because you want to scare the world. I mean, you
mm.
have to be like, the big bully in middle school. You have to
Yeah.
go now and then go beat up a smaller kid to just show that you mean business, that you're still a tough guy. Um, but another reason is simply to kill off the young people because you got too many young men, not enough jobs, not enough, young females to go around. So they can be a source of tremendous discontent. So you kill them off. Otherwise, you might have the French Revolution,
Mm.
or you might have the 1848 revolutions, which was also a very traumatic time in Europe.
Do you think that risk today is diminished by the demographic collapse, that there just aren't that many young people being produced? So the balance of, like, if you sent all your young people to go die in a war, you would make your demographic imbalance even worse. So that you've got less incentive to do it.
Well, I mean, I know there's the demographic imbalance, but at the same time, you also have tremendous discontentment
Mm,
among young men, right?
mm,
So your options are you just let them sit around all day and possibly some event will galvanize them into action, or you send off to war, and you basically stave off the possibility that they rebel.
it almost makes me paranoid that the let it rot type of movements are actually they have at least the stamp of approval from the governments because they're quite happy for disaffected youth to just go and sit in the garden somewhere and not cause trouble.
Well, you can make an argument that both the modern SSRI industry, as well as internet, are outgrowths of MK Ultra.
Mm,
And MK Ultra were, it was a vast apparatus of experiments to try to indoctrinate compliance in people, right? The 1960s was a time of tremendous revolt, was a time of tremendous discontent because of the Vietnam War. And the military, the CIA, had to figure out ways to keep people docile.
mm,
And drugs, psychedelics were a mechanism, but so were things like Woodstock, right? Popular entertainment, the hippie movement,
mm,
right?
mm,
Counterculture.
mm,
And so now we are living in an age of social media, which is a drug unto itself. Social media is I mean, the entire point of social media is to indoctrinate you into believing that nothing matters,
mhm,
that it's a very nihilistic um, platform. And so I think you're right in that they've been very successful at keeping young people docile. At the same time, if you go back in human history, 1848, the French Revolutions, there was no way at that time that people could have predicted that there'd be these revolutions, but there was a perfect storm of crises, right? You
mm.
had so like weather change, so drought during the 1848 revolutions. You had collapse in the economy. You had collapse in state finances. So
And you also
these
had an
people.
uncontrolled new medium of communication in the printing press. There were newsletters flying everywhere, stirring up discontentment and coordinating it.
And you also had new industrial productions. You
Mm,
had a new economy. You had a new bourgeoisie class.
mm,
So it's not. You can't predict the future in that way.
mm,
But the elite has many mechanisms of maintaining social control. And so I'm not saying they're going to do this, but they're keeping options open. In
mm,
fact, like if you've been reading the news about these, like UAPs.
mm,
It seems as though they're about to fake an alien invasion. So,
mm.
so I think there are many options available to them, and it's really and they respond to crises using different options.
Mm, mm, mm. Oh, another thing I really want to talk to you about. I've read a fair bit of Peter Zeihan's dire predictions about China, as well as criticisms of his arguments. What's the response to his particular brand of prognostications from inside China and from your own perspective?
Yeah, I don't think people pay attention to Peter Zeihan in China. And you're right in that his predictions, they're kind of outlandish. He's not a scholar. I mean, like he's a doomsayer.
Mm,
But at the same time, we have to recognize that the entire world, all of humanity, faces tremendous tribulation over the next 10, 20 years. You have a collapse in the economy. You have monopolization of resources. tremendous inequality, resource depletion. You have like dozens and dozens of crises converging together.
Mm.
So China will face definitely an era of tribulation, but so will everyone else.
Yeah.
And I think, and one thing that people discount is a possibility of a major geophysical event. So not a war, but a major geophysical event, meaning a mini ice age,
Yeah.
which is to be a natural part of the cycle of humanity.
I think we're also weighing up the risk of a geomagnetic storm as well, damaging our high technology on a global scale.
Yeah, we're extremely vulnerable. I mean,
Mm.
we've overextended our resources. Our entire technological infrastructure, it's much more fragile than people understand.
Mm. So another thing I wonder if there's parallels between the world wars and the big ding-dong fight between Rome and Carthage in ancient history over like monopoly access to shipping trade. And
Sure.
after that fight was resolved and Rome was kind of beaten up by the process too, there was never really another big war that the Romans got involved in. They fell into little rebellions and incursions and civil wars. And I wonder if there's a similar parallel with today that the world wars were kind of like the peak of that potential for mass conflict, and we're almost too poor to produce that level of destruction again. Like the Ukraine war has severely taxed the missile producing capabilities of both the US and Russia, and that's just one small regional skirmish.
Yeah, I think the wars will be driven by civil discontent around the world.
Mm,
So let's just use the United States as an example. So you have the problem of elite overproduction, meaning like as the pie gets smaller and smaller because the economy is shrinking and America's global hegemony is declining, then but the problem is that the elites just keep on increasing. You have more wealthy people, you have more powerful people, and so now they're competing against each other for more power. In fact, the way that I understand the second Trump presidency is a civil war within the deep state in the United States.
mm,
And I think that's what's happening. I think that Trump and his allies, they plan to overthrow the establishment. Next week, or sorry, this week, Peter Hegseth has called a meeting of like 800 of like the top military officers of the American Empire,
mm,
and Trump will be there as well. This has never happened in history because like why would you do this? And I think the answer is you're planning on a bureaucratic purge.
mm,
You're planning to force these generals to swear loyalty to the Trump regime. And as a result of this, then you will have much more conflict in America. Antifa, in many ways, it's the militant arm of the Democratic Party. You have
mm.
these right-wing militias that are the militant arm of the Republican Party. And I can easily see in the next couple of years these forces clashing against each other. So it's not that the people are organically fighting each other. It's like the deep state is trying to resolve their political differences in the streets of America by
Mm.
instigating a civil war, basically.
Mm, mm. Another thing I'm really curious about is the potential for new technologies to change the nature of conflict. So, drones have gotten a lot of attention recently, but I think bioweapons, the way the technology is changing, could open up whole new avenues, particularly for their implementation in a non-attributable way. So, if a nation state uses these tools, it won't be easy to necessarily say where they came from. And I think that changes the dynamics a lot. It's a kind of beggar thy neighbor mechanism for competition between parties. Do you have any thoughts on that front?
Yeah, I would say like for the past 20 years, America has perfected this sort of like shadow warfare, right? The
Mm,
shadow asymmetrical information warfare. And Libya, Syria are all examples of this, where America was not, they didn't send its soldiers, but its special forces were
mm,
backing these militia groups. It was using the internet to spread propaganda. And it was using aerial bombardment to weaken the regime.
mm,
Most of warfare nowadays is psychological. You're trying to change people's perceptions, right? You're trying to weaken their resolve. And that's what we're seeing happening actually in Iran today, where there's this massive propaganda campaign against the Iranian people, trying to reduce their resolve, trying to make them more frustrated with the regime. And that's really the future warfare. Even in Ukraine, I mean, Russia was fighting NATO all this time because even though it was, the Ukrainians that were the boots on the ground, it was NATO military strategy and tactics. It was NATO targeting, NATO weaponry, NATO drones, NATO special forces. So, so in the future, in all future wars. These wars will be much more hybrid. It'll be much more diverse. It'll be much more stealth, much more informational, much more psychological.
Mm. Are the tactics a little bit like how the Mongols managed to roll out so quickly that they basically gave the local elites a chance to say, basically, open your doors to us and give us whatever tribute we want, or we're going to make a horrific example of you for the next town over to hear about? And I'm thinking of Confessions of an Economic Hitman as that kind of model.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great analogy. So with technology nowadays, it's very easy for you to infiltrate a nation and map out the different quarters of power within that nation. So look at the color revolutions in Nepal and other places, right? Well,
Mm,
that's because the Americans went in, they've installed these NGOs that are able to recruit young people. And through the internet, they've been able to sow seeds of discontent. They've been able to brainwash people to think in a certain way. They were able to control the information space. So that's how wars will be fought in the future.
mm. Are modern populations incapable of organic revolutions anymore? Like, or do artificial ones come in to steer the direction before they reach that point?
Well, I mean, you can make the argument that these revolutions in the past were never really organic.
Mm, mm,
It was always an elite, a certain faction of the elite,
mm,
which galvanized the people. They sort of took advantage of people's discontent, frustration, and they led them to overthrow the regime. Organic revolutions in the past have been suppressed bloodily. I mean, like, if you go back to the 17th century, the Anabasta movement in Europe, which was a precursor to the French Revolution. But the problem was they didn't actually have an intellectual elite to
mm,
lead them in the
mm,
way that during the French Revolution, Robespierre and these lawyers, they were basically all lawyers. I mean,
mm.
they were able to coalesce and lead the people in their rage against the king. So yeah, I would say that if it's an organic peasant movement, it will be easily suppressed.
Well, very closely related point. You recently were talking, I saw, about how the structure of militaries strongly influences the structure of governments that go along with them. And I wonder if we have a future where, for example, drones become the way that domestic policing are done. How does that change the power structure that emerges out of that? Would that be another kind of nudge away from democracy?
I think that's a great question, and I completely agree in that we are moving towards an over-bureaucratization of society. And during this process, then certain things will happen that were unimaginable maybe 10 years ago, right? So drone policing is one example, as you say, but also national ID cards, right? Digital
Mm,
ID
mm,
cards that they're rolling out in the UK. Um, Laws that prevent free speech, greater social media control,
mm,
possibly the implanting of microchips into people's bodies.
mm,
Okay, so as things move, then the logic of bureaucraticism is a movement towards totalitarianism. Okay, I mean that's just logical.
mm,
If you just look at how bureaucracies think and behave, and you look at how bureaucracies have become to dominate the governments of every Western nation, then the West is definitely moving towards authoritarianism. I don't think we'll reach that point because these societies will collapse before then. I
yeah.
think these societies have become too top heavy. I mean, because it's extremely it's it's it consumes a lot of resources to maintain a bureaucracy because they're parasites, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's the same issue with artificial intelligence that we will never achieve superintelligence because we don't have the resources for
Mm,
superintelligence. You would need like a Pacific Ocean of fresh water.
mm.
You would need like multiple United States for electricity consumption in order to produce this superintelligence. And we don't have these resources. And so the bureaucratic state, it's a parasite. And eventually you reach a point where it's consuming too many resources and it's going to collapse. It's going to implode due to its own greed, to its own incompetence, due to its own weight, basically.
It's a diminishing return on complexity, basically. And I wonder if the
Basically.
elites, if these high technologies do allow them to govern really, really efficiently by like mass surveillance and all of these extra tools that they've never had before, the second that technology goes away, they'll have no backup culture of how to manage the population anymore. So it could be quite destabilizing. And yeah, that technology can disappear very rapidly.
Right. Okay, so I think you're making an incorrect assumption. The
Hmm.
incorrect assumption is that with more data, with more technology, the bureaucrats are able to make better decisions. And that's not true.
Mm,
So you just look at an example like ChatGPT, right? So my students have access to ChatGPT, and you would think that with ChatGPT, they could write better essays because ChatGPT will provide the structure, they have instant access to all the evidence, all the facts that they would need. They just have to like, make some subtle changes and make it more human-like.
mm,
But guess what? They
mm,
become over-reliant on ChatGPT
mm,
and
mm,
and their essays become obviously written by artificial intelligence, right? It's they don't even try anymore.
mm.
So that's the issue with technology in that we assume that technology it will empower us to be better thinkers, and that's true for maybe like 1% of the population. But for most people, it's people are lazy. They'll become dependent. They'll become subservient to this technology. And
Mm.
I don't think this is different in the bureaucracy. Like Palantir. If they provide all this information to the police, it's not going to make the police much more efficient. It's going to make them much more inefficient
Mm.
because they're going to stop using their brains and they're going to start relying more on the software. The software is clumsy. Like
Yeah.
all software, it's badly coded, it's very clumsy, it's going to make tons of mistakes. And what's going to happen is that the bureaucracy will spend so much time trying to remedy these mistakes or justifying these mistakes. They don't have time to be proactive.
Yeah. 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 No, I get that. I get that. Um, I now you're really interested in education, and in the West, there's a growing abandonment of compulsory state-controlled education. Like the rise of homeschooling has been really interesting, and it may well be accelerated in the next decade by AI, kind of helping people do that. And you had an argument that schooling is mostly designed for brainwashing to create manageable citizens. What does that suggest about the future of the West if people manage to wiggle away from that state-controlled mass education? Or does the internet do such a good job at brainwashing people that they don't really need it anymore?
Um, I don't think the Western model of governance is sustainable in the long term.
Mm,
Uh, I mean, what we're seeing is the demise of the nation state. Why do we have public schooling? Because we need to brainwash kids to believe that a nation state exists, that there's a mythology,
mm,
there's a history to the nation state. It's alive. And if you can't get kids to believe in these stories anymore, the nation state ceases to have relevance. So I just think that we've reached a turning point in human history. Within the next 5, 10, 20 years, we'll see a complete collapse of traditional paradigms.
mm,
Um, and I think that this homeschooling movement is just an indicator. It's like a canary in the coal mine
mm,
of what's going to happen. I have 3 kids, and I would never send my kids to a school because I work in a school, and I can tell you, kids don't learn anything in a school. And I work in a private school as well,
mm,
right? So you can imagine what public schools are like. My younger brother works in a public school, and when I talk to him, I mean, like I can feel that kids don't learn anything anymore. Kids are
mm,
just there and they're taught this, DEI crap. They're taught, how to be anti-racist, but they're not taught to read books. They're not taught how to write essays. They're not taught how to think for themselves.
mm,
So I don't think there's any relevance for public schools anymore.
mm, mm. A couple of related questions. Do you think civilizations get better at going through cycles of growth and collapse when they do it multiple times? And is China an example of a civilization that's been through many cycles before and has kind of learnt something along the way? And does that give us lessons for what may well be the coming collapse of industrial civilization?
Well, I'll refer to Oswald Spengler here, right? For Oswald Spengler, a civilization is no different from a human life.
Mm,
It's meant to be born, it's meant to rise, and it's meant to die. So civilizations aren't meant to be reborn, they're meant to die and go away.
mm,
And I think that's why the Western civilization has been so innovative because these civilizations died and a new civilization came into place. And these civilizations were able to learn the mistakes of previous civilizations and adapt to new circumstances. Like periods of tremendous human creativity include the Bronze Age collapse, right? Because
mm,
after Bronze Age collapse, you had the collapse of the Mycenaean state and then the rise of the Greek polis, which became the foundation for Western civilization. But you also had, because of the decline of Egyptian power, the rise of a new kingdom called the Kingdom of Israel, run by David, the Davidic kingdom, and that's what gave us the Bible. So I think all civilizations they should die at some point
mm.
because then it allows for innovation, human creativity to flourish. The problem with China is that because of its unique geographic location, because of its size, because of the basically just the law of inertia, it's been around for like too long,
Mm.
and eventually it needs to go away.
Interesting. Just as an aside, does that position put you in a difficult place living in China? Like, we get an outside story of how authoritarian and controlled everything is, and I really question whether that is the lived experience for people in China.
Yeah, so the rule that I learned in China is if you don't get in people's way, if you um if you don't really try to make too much money for yourself, no one cares. Because
Hmm.
the paradigm is you only want power in order to obtain wealth. And because power is a zero-sum game, then everyone's in competition with each other. So if you're not participating in this game of power, then people think that it's because you're worthless or you're stupid or you're weak, in which case you don't matter.
Mm.
So, I've to be honest with you, I've been there for almost 30 years. I've had multiple opportunities to become extremely wealthy, and I chose not to participate in money making. So the easiest example is, I was in China doing international education in 2008, and this was like at the start of the boom. And I was at a very good public school, and I had all these connections overseas. I'm a Yale graduate, and I knew a lot of admissions officers in America, and I could have easily started a consultancy, like a boutique consultancy, and made millions of dollars for myself a year.
Mm.
But if I were to do that, I would surrender my freedom to think for myself because I would have to have investors. I would need to pay off officials. I would need to have, partners. I would be bought into the system.
Mm.
In which case,
Captive of
I
your own
would lose my
success.
independence.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Yeah,
get.
I would lose my independence. So I consciously made a decision that I will maintain my freedom, but I will have to give up success because you cannot have both.
Mm.
Okay. And
Mm.
it, and I'll be honest with you, there was many years when I wanted to move back to the Western world, when I gave up on China, but seeing how things have developed, um, I think I made the right decision to stay in China and just be a normal person in China
Mm.
because what matters to me is the capacity to be creative. What matters to me is my intellectual independence. And I think that I'm able to do this in China much better than I'm able to do this in Canada or the United States or Australia.
Mm. Mm. I love that answer. Um, This might be a bit of an odd question for you, but how do you see biotechnology changing the course of history? Because I've done a lot of research about like where crops and livestock come from and how that's like been major players in geopolitics in the past. And now we have like a new understanding of biology, we have new tools, and we're just starting to like play around with what we can do with them. And do you think that might be a wild card that could move the trajectory of history in unusual directions that people aren't quite expecting?
Um, I think it's possible, but my intuition tells me that society has become so ossified in that you have so much bureaucracy and you have so many vested interested in only maintaining the status quo that's
Mm,
very hard for new ideas to take root in society. So
mm,
it's entirely possible that after a major civilizational collapse, like a Bronze Age collapse, then a new society could implement artificial intelligence, biotechnology, in a way that's beneficial for everyone. And
mm,
that and I think that could be a net positive. But I think that the way that things are structured now, there's just too much ossification.
mm, mm.
It's very hard to propose new ideas and to implement new ideas in today's world.
Well, following on from that, do you think that epidemics are likely to be a major factor in the next century? Because they're usually much bigger than the impact of wars. They're less flashy. They get, less, songs and sagas written about them. But if you look in terms of the actual impact they have on the trajectory of societies, they're often much bigger. And I'm even discounting, like, new biotechnology and bioweapons here, just boring old diseases that have been around for millions, well, not millions, thousands of years. Do you think they could actually sneak up on us and have a major impact?
You look at every plague in human history, and these plagues go back thousands of years,
Mm,
right? It's always you have too much concentration in urban areas.
hmm.
Humans live too close to animals. Um,
And prolonged
there's
economic stress.
yeah, prolonged economic stress, too much inequality, so poor people lose their sense of hygiene.
Mm,
So it's a recurring pattern in human history, and the way that we have megacities, it's just I mean, it's not sustainable like these
mm,
megacities that we have today.
mm.
The fact that tens of millions of people live together, and most of them live in dire poverty. So it's only a matter of time before the next epidemic, and I think that you will have a cascading series of epidemics throughout the next century.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's things like tuberculosis as well that don't arrive like with bells and whistles. They just kind of creep along and become the
Yeah.
new normal before you even realize it.
Yeah. And also, I mean, we have to understand these vaccines that we put into our bodies, we do not know the long-term effects
Mm,
of these vaccines, right? I mean, it's entirely possible, like the more vaccines you take, the lesser your immune system is able to resist against new pathogens. I mean, like we just I mean, like like the world that we live in is so complex that it sort of paralyzes the imagination.
mm,
So we trust these vaccines, but it's entirely possible these vaccines will give rise to new problems that we could not possibly imagine before.
mm, mm. Now, I loved your analysis of a comparison of oral, written, and visual cultures and how that influences, how the whole culture structure builds up. And I wonder if you're seeing any hints of digital technology being used to shift us back towards a more oral or visual culture. Is writing losing its power and preeminence in common culture?
Right. So, digital culture, it's a really um, complex topic. My issue with digital culture is that it leaves less room for the human imagination.
Mm,
So, when you move from oral to written, literary culture, then into digital culture, what you're seeing is a less of a reliance on the human imagination, right? Because when you speak to each other, then you're forced to be fully engaged and you're forced to fully exercise your imagination.
mm,
Literary culture, you're forced to as well.
mm,
Digital culture, visual culture, you're not required to exercise your imagination as much. All the information is embedded in the picture in itself. And that to me is very worrying
mm.
because what makes us fundamentally human is our capacity to constantly refresh our imagination. That's the animating force of the universe.
Mm.
That's I think it's our imagination that's a fundamental building block of the universe.
Yeah.
And if we become less capable of using our imagination, then that's going to cause a tremendous breakdown in civilization.
Mm. One really general question I want to ask too. You've made relatively concrete near-term predictions about history and geopolitics. How do you weigh up the risks and the payoffs of that strategic move? Like in the recent past, you've had some successes, and it's helped kind of propel you into the spotlight. But do you ever sometimes hesitate to put things out there that you are pretty confident are going to happen, but you worry about the pros and cons of being right or wrong?
Yeah, I mean, so I make these predictions as a way to validate for myself whether my understanding of the universe is correct,
Yep.
right? So if my understanding of human history is correct, then my understanding is based on certain analytical models of how humans behave.
Mm,
So I make these predictions in order to test these analytical models. So I'm perfectly happy being wrong because being wrong gives me rich data in which to better refine my modeling.
mm,
But you're absolutely right in that a lot of these predictions can be politically sensitive. And so I don't make any predictions about China because I'm based in China and I don't want to piss off my regime. I've already pissed off the Americans. I've already pissed off the Canadians. I don't want to piss off everyone
mm,
because I have a family and we need to be somewhere. So the Chinese regime has been very tolerant of my predictions. And, word has been given to me through many different channels that I shouldn't make any predictions about China.
Okay, yeah, that's sensible. I also wondered too if you have any idea about how paradigm shifts happen in the field of history or geopolitics. Like, has there been like major turning points in how historians and analysts and strategists kind of see the world? I think,
Well, I mean, I think that history is a tool of power. History is a mechanism by which the elite um, create and imagine community for the people they want to control.
mm,
And this is most clear during the Roman times. It was basically the Romans who invented history. I know that Herodotus is the father of history,
mm,
but if you look at when history was used politically, when it was used pervasively, then it was during the Roman time, right? It was Augustus Caesar who sponsored Livy and the official writing of Roman history, and it was extremely powerful
yeah.
in that now you have a sprawling empire, you're able to unify people's sense of their past of tradition. If you
Mm,
actually go back and you look at Roman history, we take it that Livy was writing it objectively, but he was not. I mean, most of Roman history, if you analyze it closely, it doesn't make any sense.
mm,
If you look at Hannibal Barca's invasion of Rome, it makes absolutely no sense. Any military historian can tell you that, oh, Battle of Cannae, when Hannibal was able to kill 80,000, I don't know the exact number, but 80,000 Romans, that makes no sense whatsoever.
mm.
So history is bunk, as Henry Ford would say. So you have these paradigm shifts when new elites come into power, and they need to change the way that the past has been interpreted before.
Mm. I guess the most recent one would be the horrible classic Candlelight, the end of history when the Soviet Union fell,
Oh
was
yeah,
was one of those, probably a
but
medium-sized example of a paradigm shift in history.
it's really interesting because you look at every time when a hegemon comes to power, it's always the end of history because God meant for this to happen,
Yeah, yeah.
and nothing else will replace us. This is the end of history, okay? So if you go back to the Iliad, Virgil, I mean, he wrote it as like the end of prophecy. There's this prophecy of Aeneas founding Rome, and when he found Rome, then we eventually lead to Augustus Caesar, which is the end of the prophecy, which is the
Mm,
end of history.
mm. I'm sure that relates back to eschatology in a way, that
Yes,
stories have beginnings, middles, and ends.
that's what
And
makes a story.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, a thing I really want to ask you about too. I'm picking up a growing, I guess you call it a scientific movement, a story, maybe a history, um, kind of rewriting the story of human evolution in China with the discovery of interesting fossils and some genetic evidence coming through that out of Africa isn't quite as simple a story as we have previously told in the West. And I'm just curious about like the potential cultural impact of that and interest in it in China, if it changes the way the Chinese people see themselves, if they tell a different story about human origins.
Yeah, so if you look at our understanding of human evolution, most of it comes from the imperial age, right? The 19th century, late 19th century, when the Europeans dominated the world, and they had an incentive
Mm,
to write history in a way that shows um, that the Europeans are the end of history, the evolution leads to the Europeans.
mm,
But if you just look at just how humans behave, what you will discover is that we've always been explorers, right? So the idea that we were just in one place and we were happy being in one place, that makes no sense.
mm,
But not only that, but we've always been traders. So um, these different societies were always in contact with each other. Maybe they weren't written down, maybe the memory of it was lost to us, but they were always in communication with each other.
mm,
So human evolution, it's a much more dynamic, much more organic, and much more vibrant process than I think that we fully appreciate. Also, the idea of evolution means improvement. And you can make the argument that we've devolved over the centuries, the millennia. Why? Because during the Ice Age, we were an extremely imaginative, storytelling people that was at peace with ourselves and with other cultures. And now, we're this barbaric, mechanical, unimaginative war machine that goes around and kills people for no particular reason.
mm, mm. Well, I mean, that makes me wonder, have you pondered like how much of history is actually unknowable? Are we going to reach a point where we just don't have anything else to base improvements of the story and we just kind of have to shrug and leave some gaps, maybe particularly the further you go back in time?
Well, I mean, I think history is what we imagine it to be. And the future is what we imagine it to be.
Mm,
So it's important to go and study history because when we imagine history, we're also imagining our future. So I would rather believe that history is a much more dynamic, open-ended process than we believe it to be. I
mm,
want us to believe that like every society was engaged in exploration, in intellectual pursuits, in trying to be one with the universe. And I want to believe that these societies all impacted each other.
mm,
So it's not like Christianity only developed, in Jerusalem in the year 1000 because of King David, blah, blah, blah. I think that's much too simple. I
mm,
think that all beliefs impacted each other. If you look at what Jesus was saying, you have tremendous resonances in Hinduism, in Buddhism,
mm,
in Eastern philosophy. Um, so, so I think it's really important to understand that how human thought it's a constantly evolving process that's multifaceted, and it doesn't really have a particular origin. And we should not think about what the origin is. We should think about, does this story make sense to me? Is
mm.
this improving my understanding of the universe? That's what matters. Whether or not, okay, well, it was the Europeans who discovered gunpowder, and it was the Africans who first gave rise to humanity. That's not relevant to our future.
Mm. I think that's a really great place that we could round things off. So, do you want to let people know where they can learn more about you, see your work, your lectures? Where's the best place where they can go looking? I'll put all the links in the show notes.
Right. So my YouTube channel is called Predictive History, and that's where I upload all my lectures. But I also have a Substack, also called Predictive History, which is and the Substack is for me to talk much more um, concretely about how the world is developing. My YouTube channel, it's really an education course. It's me lecturing to Chinese high school students about certain topics, about certain topics. So I suggest following both watching my YouTube channel. It's all free, as well as my Substack. So it's most of the content is free, but for politically sensitive content, I do paywall it.
Excellent, excellent. And I highly recommend people check that out. There's a diversity and a depth of content there that I haven't seen anyone else doing online, and you deserve all of the success that you're getting.
But I will make this point, okay?
Mm,
And it's a side point. I'm not trying to brag, but like I look at other people's Substack content, and it's amazing how so few people have time to write nowadays.
mm.
I mean, like they're posting pictures, they're making some comments, but actually to write a long essay, a long form essay. I don't see that many people doing that nowadays, and I'm not sure if, that's the way Substack is, or just people don't have the time and the patience to actually sit down and think deeply about the world nowadays.
It could be a symptom of the growing hollowing out of intellectual capacity, particularly with AI and the younger generations. They've got a shortcut to ticking the boxes and moving on with their courses, and they're missing the opportunity to dig in really deep. But I know with your students, you're really putting them on the spot. You're giving them those opportunities to develop themselves.
Yeah, and the public response has been overwhelming. So I get like tons of emails saying they would like to come to my class. Like they might be in like, Ethiopia or like, Chile, but they want to come and sit in my class.
Mm,
And they want to experience it for themselves.
mm.
So I definitely hope to in the future. I have three young kids, so my so I can't really travel, but I'm hoping in the future to like do more workshops, more lectures around the world in the future.
Excellent. I look forward to it. I wish you all the best with that. And yeah,
Okay,
thank you
thank you so
for
much.
taking the time to come and talk today.
No, no, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and let's definitely try to do this again some other time.
Excellent. Thanks for listening to Recombination Nation. If you liked that interview, you will love my free weekly Substack blog, packed with experimental farm updates, book reviews, think pieces, and recommended long form content from across the internet. A paid subscription will support my work and unlock the archive of past posts. Next week, I interview Dr. Stephen Skolnick about his exciting theories that link the human microbiome with a range of devastating diseases. And beyond that, I ask him if the bugs in our stomachs might have influenced human evolution and culture.